My name is Horacio Garcia, and I'm with Daniel Duas and Felix Rodriguez, a retired CIA official who's traveled the world and fought in many places and done many things. Thank you for this, Mr. Rodriguez. Thank you for the interview.
Pleasure.
So let's start off with the basic. Mr. Rodriguez, tell us about yourself. What do you do right now?
What am I doing now? Well, I am now president of the brigade, Association 2506. I have been president about 5 times. This will definitely be my last time as president of the brigade. And I also do a lot of speeches in different places. I just came back last night from Tampa. I was speaking to the Special Forces University, where they had a group of 40 Special Forces people from the different armed forces of the United States. There were SEALs, Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine Special Forces, Air Force Special Forces, and even one from Poland, Special Forces from Poland.
All right, and Mr. Rodriguez, how and why did you first get involved with the CIA?
Well, I was going to school here I came here in 1954, Perkiomen Prep in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. And while I was there, that's when Castro took over in 1959. And I thought, especially at the very beginning, the massive assassination that took place by his firing squad, with really people that were not even lawyers, had nothing to do with justice. I thought something had to be done. So the first thing that I got involved was in 1959, I went to the Dominican Republic. It was called the Anti-Communist Legion of the Caribbean. That was the first attempt against Castro. And then that failed in the city of Trinidad. Then I came back to the state, graduated from high school. I was accepted in engineering at the University of Miami in 1960 after graduation. But then I saw what was going on, and I joined what later became the Bay of Pigs invasion. I didn't know it was the CIA. We thought that there were rich Cubans who had lost a lot of properties in Cuba who were financing the operation. Of course, later on, we learned the U.S. government was involved in it.
So, Mr. Rodriguez, how long were you with the CIA?
Well, after 1960, when I joined them, later it was the CIA, I actually was with them until 1962, which I briefly left the CIA because I got married to my present wife of 53 years. But then it only lasted a few months because the October crisis took place. And I was working in a company called Tobin Packaging Company. And that afternoon I was called by a CIA agent. He wanted to meet me. And actually we met at the parking lot of the Howard & Johnson across from the University of Miami. And at that point in time, he told me and said, the Marines are going to land in Cuba and we need you. So my answer was, Tom, if the Marines are going to land in Cuba, what the hell do you need me for? He said, well, we need you to parachute near a Soviet base in Santa Clara to set up a radio beacon so that our Air Force can hit it with precision. So from that point on, I could not even pick up my wife at work, and I could not call anybody. They put me in a safe house. They brought the radio beacon, which I knew how to operate. Parachute, they told me how to do the 3 points of contact jumping because I had never jumped from a plane. And just before we took off, that when Khrushchev backed down and took the missiles back to Moscow and Russia, and that it was defused. And from there on, I continued to work with the agency for a period of time. In '63, I was in Fort Benning, Georgia, as a second lieutenant in the Army for less than a year. And then I continued a special operation with the CIA until the time I retired.
Where did your ventures and your work with the CIA take you around the world?
Well, with them, my first mission first of all, was the missions in Cuba, intelligence operation going in and out of Cuba. At that time, then in 1966, I was assigned to Venezuela to set up a communication system for the Venezuelan intelligence service. Then I came back, and that's when I was assigned to Bolivia in 1967 to track down Che Guevara.
So, what did the CIA really intend to do with Che Guevara one day? Because they didn't capture him alive, correct?
Well, at the beginning, everybody thought that Che Guevara had been killed in Africa in 1964. They knew that he was in Africa, and there was an operation run at the Tanganyika River in the Belgian Congo. And there were 6 boats, 4 of them were sunk, and they thought Che Guevara was in one of them. We didn't realize he escaped in the other 2. And he went to live in Prague. We'll learn that later on. And then he didn't want to go back to Cuba. He had problems with Castro because Che Guevara was pro-Chinese. And of course, the Soviet Union hated the Chinese as much as they hated the United States. And they, of course, will not support him in any way or form. So Castro sent a couple of mayors, including Ramiro Valdez, to meet him in Prague and convince him to go back to Cuba. They were going to give him the opportunity of another country in Latin America. And that's when they selected Bolivia. And that's where he went in 1960. When they realized that he was there, because of the fact that they had captured Reyes Debray and Ciro Bustos, who were 2 foreigners. One was a French intellectual, and the other one was an Argentinian newspaper guy. And they were the one who confirmed that Che Guevara was indeed in Bolivia in that guerrilla. And knowing that the Bolivian armed forces were not prepared for that, immediately the United States dispatched a special forces team from Panama, commanded by Major Ralph Shelton. They call him Pappy Shelton, from Tennessee, to start training a special 2nd Ranger Battalion in anti-guerrilla operations to support the Bolivian against Che Guevara's guerrilla. And then they sent a few Cubans to La Paz to work with the Minister of Interior, and they selected 2 of us to work with the battalion in operations. The reason they selected a couple of us, Cubans, was because there was a prohibition by Ambassador Henderson, U.S. ambassador in Bolivia, who prohibited any U.S. citizenship to participate in areas of combat, areas of danger. Because Vietnam was already beginning to take place. There were already American troops coming back in plastic bag, and they didn't want to have American coming back in plastic bag from South America. And of course, we were not citizens, so we were not in violation of the ambassador's laws. So they come to Miami, they selected 2 of us, and we went to work with the 2nd Ranger Battalion, also with the 8th Division headquarters, and that's the area where Che was operating.
So my next question was, how were you able to capture Che?
Well, it was a long process. First of all, they had no idea where he was. But we were lucky that we were able to capture a guerrilla by the name of Paco, Jose Castillo Chavez. And I managed to keep him alive, to interrogate him. And Paco was able to tell us the way that Che will move in the operational area. He divided his guerrilla in 3 groups whenever he moved from point A to point B, what he called vanguard, center, and rear guard. He would have about 6 guerrillas in the vanguard, about a kilometer ahead of him. He would be with the main force in the middle, and he had another group of guerrilla a kilometer behind, another 6 or 8. The purpose was that if those people encounter an army patrol, he would be protected in the middle. He'd be able to maneuver and get out of the ambush. And that's how the way he operated. And of course, Paco gave us the war name of all of those involved in the vanguard, in the center, and in the rear guard. So in late September, there was an encounter of a Lieutenant Eduardo Galindo Garteche, and he was able to kill 3 members of the vanguard of Che. So I came over to Pucará to wait for his arrival with the 3 dead bodies. And Lieutenant Galindo told me, he said, mi Capitan, I saw the guerrilla in the distance, and then when I started preparing the ambush, the guerrilla surprised me. What happened is he had seen Che Guevara's group far away, and the vanguard was already coming up the hill. So that confirmed what Paco have told us. And there were 3 people killed in that operation. There were 3 guerrillas. One was Coco Peredo, who was the leader of the guerrilla on the Bolivian side. The other one was Mario Gutierrez Ardaya, who was a Bolivian doctor. And the other one was a Cuban officer by the name of Miguel. And later we learned his name was Manuel Hernandez Osorio, a Cuban captain from the U.S. Armed Forces, from the Cuban Armed Forces. With these 3 names, we knew that the Che Guevara was in the area. So I was able to convince the head of the 8th Division headquarters, Colonel Joaquin Centeno Anaya, to cut short the 2 weeks that was remained for training of the battalion and move the battalion to the operational area. So by the 1st of October of 1967, the battalion moved into the Valle Grande area. One company stayed there to resupply the unit, to maintain communication with the operational companies. Then one company was dispatched, commanded by Captain Lopez Layton, to cover the Rio Grande, so that the guerrilla would not be able to move to the other side of the river, who was the responsibility of the 4th Division headquarters. And we were on the 8th Division, even though the battalion have capability of operating anywhere in country. But they had identified themselves very closely with Colonel Centeno on the 8th Division. The other company was commanded by Captain Celso Torrelio, who later became president of Bolivia. And Celso was set up with his people at Higuera, who was the last place where the guerrilla was seen. And then Captain Gary Prado, with his 180 men, was assigned the responsibility of searching the area. Now, he carried with him a special intelligence unit that we had trained, the CIA we had trained in La Esperanza, where he got the training. And there were a group of about 10 young soldiers in civilian clothes who spoke the dialect, the Quechua and the Aymara. And they were trained intelligence. And they moved in civilian clothes, talking to the farmers to gather intelligence for the battalion. So on the 7th of October, they had contact with a farmer who told them that there were voices at this place called Quebrada del Juro. Nobody was supposed to be there. They gave the information to Gary Prado, and on the 8th, who happens to be a Sunday, he surrounded the Quebrada del Juro. And in the morning, when they started moving in, of course, the guerrilla was there, so it was a big firefight. There were casualties from both sides. And that's where Che Guevara was captured alive. He was wounded on the right leg, and at that time, when he approached, he faced our troops, he told them, "Don't shoot, I am Che. I am worse to you, more alive than dead." That's when they captured him and took him to Captain Gary Prado. At the time, I was in the wrong way in the air base. There was an air strip in Valle Grande. I was installing some PRC-10 Army radios on 3 Bolivian Air Force aircraft. Now, the Bolivian aircraft at the time had only VHF, which is a high frequency. They had no compatible frequency with the ground troops' radios, and they could not communicate with the ground troop to get support. So I borrowed 3 PRC-10 from the Army, and I set up 1 PRC-10 inside of each plane, so that they would be able to talk to the ground troops and get support to them. I had finished 2. I was working on the 3rd plane when the information came over the radio that Papa Cansado, which meant that the head of the guerrilla was captured, but he was alive and wounded. Now, at the time, we didn't know whether it was Che Guevara or whether it was Inti Peredo, the Bolivian commander, brother of Coco. So I flew in the back of one of the 86s, and Major Serrate, the head of operation, flew in the back of the other plane. And we flew over the area, and we were able to verify with the ground troops that Papa Cansado was the foreigner. I mean, it was Che Guevara. So we came back. I talked to Colonel Centeno, and he dispatched that same afternoon a Lieutenant Colonel Selig, who flew in a helicopter to the operational area to make sure that he gathered all the documentation from Che, and the soldier will not take souvenirs from his belonging, and tried to interrogate him. And that evening we had a gathering at the hotel with all his officers. I brought out a couple of bottles of scotch that I had bought in the past for an occasion like this, and we celebrated what he believed to be the end of the guerrillas in Bolivia. And I asked him if I could accompany him. Of course, everybody wanted to go. So he spoke to his officer, and he told them that he knew that all of them wanted to go. At the same time, he realized that this man, Che Guevara, have done a lot of harm to my country, to Cuba. And if they will not object, that he will take me with him. And they all agreed. I had an excellent relationship with all of them. So on the following morning, we prepared to leave. I am also a radio operator, so I prepared a message which I telegraphed to the embassy nearby for Washington. I was telling him that Che Guevara was captured, that he was alive, and if they wanted to keep him alive, they should move strongly with the Bolivian government, because they don't like to keep prisoners. And I took my radio equipment with me the following day to Higueras. So we dispatched, we were flying a small helicopter, Colonel Centeno, myself. It was piloted by a major of the Bolivian Air Force, Major Jaime Niño de Guzman. We landed right next to the schoolhouse about 7:30 in the morning. It was about half an hour flight. And we went into the room. Che Guevara was tied down on the floor, and in front of him was the dead body of a couple of Cuban guerrillas. One was Captain Oslo Pantoja, who was in charge of training of foreign guerrillas in Cuba, and another Cuban captain. And I come in with other officers, including Colonel Centeno. Whenever Centeno started asking questions to Che, he just would look at him, he would not answer him. He didn't say a word. To a point that Colonel Centeno told him, look, you are a foreigner. You invaded my country. At least you should have the courtesy to answer me. Didn't say a word. So we left the room. I asked the colonel if I could photograph all his documentation for my government, for the U.S. government, and he asked Colonel Celis to give it to me. I was given a bag, was like this, round. It had camel color, and inside was a German diary, a big one, like a book. Of course, it was written in Spanish. It was his diary. He had some code book, numerical code book provided by Red China, and that he used for ciphering, encipher, and deciphering messages to Cuba. Now, he could transmit, he could receive from Cuba, but he could not transmit back to Cuba because the Cubans sent him a broken transmitter. Now, we are convinced that that was done purposely to abandon him. They didn't want him to be successful because of pressure from the Soviet Union. The fact was that in December 31st, 1966, he had a meeting with Mario Monge, the head of the Communist Party of Bolivia, who had, by the way, had met with Fidel Castro 2 months before. And in that meeting, he'd retrieved away any support from the Communist Party for Che Guevara. And even told the people who were with him from the Communist Party that if they stayed, they would be expelled from the Communist Party. The transmitter wasn't working. They also retrieved a Cuban intelligence officer who was assigned in La Paz by the name of Renan Montero. He's the one who received all of them when they arrived in La Paz. They all came with false documentation. They came with documentation from Panama, from Uruguay, from Ecuador, like businessmen. And that man is the one who had extremely great contacts in La Paz. Well, this officer, Renan Montero, as soon as all of them came in, he was called back to Cuba, and they told Che that he had to go back because his visa had expired. And then we learned that he had acquired the Bolivian citizenship, which meant they did it purposely to leave him all by himself. So he could not transmit to him, only received messages from him. In that documentation, they have some booklets that was typewritten, a message from Cuba that he received, that he was able to receive, who was signed by a guy named Ariel. And we assume at the time that Ariel was Fidel. But then later on, we learned from Benigno, who defected the guerrilla later on, defected out of Cuba after he was survived the guerrillas with Che Guevara in Bolivia. And he told me that Ariel was not Fidel, it was Juan Carretero who was in charge of communication intelligence for this operation itself. So I took all the documentation and started photographing the diary, all the documents that he had with him. He had some personal photograph. He had a mask for his asthma with some medical equipment. He had those booklets. And then I came back to the room by myself. I stood in front of him. He was tied down on the floor. I looked at him and said, Commander, I'd like to talk to you. And he looked to me very arrogant. Said, nobody talks to me. Nobody interrogates me. So at that time, I look at him and say, Commander, I didn't come here to interrogate you. Our ideals are different, but I admire you. You used to be head of a state in Cuba. You're here because you believe in your ideals, even though I am convinced they are mistaken. So at that point in time, he looked at me. He saw if I was laughing. When he saw that I was serious, he said, can I sit? Can you untie me? So I called a soldier who was outside. I have to order 3 times for him to untie Commander Guevara, because we treated each other with respect during the whole time. So we untied him, we sat him in a little bench, and then we started talking. Now, whenever I asked him questions that were of tactical interest to us, he would say, I cannot answer that. But even though at a point in time I pinched about the fact that we knew that he was in Africa and he didn't want to talk about it, I say, well, you don't want to talk about it, Commander, but one of your people have told us that you had like 10,000 guerrillas and they were very poor soldiers. And he said, well, if I had 10,000, it would have been different. But you're right. The Africans were very poor soldiers. And we continue to talk. We talk about the fact, for example, the economy in Cuba, which I told him, the economical situation in Cuba. And like they all do, he blamed the embargo for the economical situation in Cuba. To which I say, well, that's ironic on your part, Commander, because you were the president of the Cuban National Bank and president of industry, and you are not economist. So he looked at me and said, you know how he became president of the National Bank? I said, I have no idea. So I was sitting down, and Fidel was talking, and Fidel was asking for a dedicated, I understood he was asking for a dedicated communist, and I rose my hand. And he was asking for a dedicated economist, and that's how I became president of the National Bank. So I thought that was a joke on his part not to answer me. But later on, when I met Benigno, who's the one who lives in Paris now after he left Cuba, he told me that indeed he was right next to Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos when that happened, and indeed he understood Fidel was asking for a dedicated communist and rose his hand. And several months later, he became the president of the National Bank, and he knew nothing about it. And of course, it was a disaster for the Cuban economy. So we did have different speeches. I went back to photograph the diary. At one point in time, I go back again to talk to him. He's talking actually at that point in time, and we could hear a shot next door and a body coming, hitting the ground. They had just killed a guy by the name of Aniceto who was wounded in the combat. He had a bullet through his eyes. So Che was talking, he went like this. He didn't say a word, and he continued to speak. At that point in time, he thought that his life really was going to be spared. And I started waiting to see what happened. There was a phone call, and the Colonel Centeno was still in the operational area, and they called me because I was the highest ranking officer in La Higuera. I had the rank of captain, and there were only 2 Bolivian lieutenants in there. So I went to the only phone in the area. I received the code message 500, 600. It was a very simple code that we had agreed was 500 Che Guevara, 600 dead, 700 keep him alive. So I asked to be repeated. They again confirmed 500, 600. So when Colonel Centeno came before he left, I called him aside. I said, "Mi Coronel, this order from your high command to eliminate the prisoner. The order from my government is try to keep him alive at all costs." He said, "Felix," and my name was Felix Ramos. He said, "Felix, we have worked empirically. We're very grateful to you. But this is order from my president, my commander-in-chief." He looked at his watch. He said, "The helicopter is going to come several times, bringing food and ammunition and taking our wounded and our dead. He's going to come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I want your word of honor that you will bring me back the dead body of Che. And you can execute him any way you want because we know how much harm he had done to your country." So I look at him and say, "Mi Coronel, try to make them change their mind. It's very important for us to keep him alive. But if there is not a counter order, I give you my word as a man that I will bring you back the dead body of Che." We embraced and he left. And sure enough, the helicopter came back several times. In one of them, the pilot, Major Niño Guzman, came with a camera from Major Saucedo, the head of intelligence, and he told me, "Mi Capitan, the Major Saucedo want a picture with the prisoner." So I look at Che and say, "Commander, do you mind?" He said, "No." So we took him out of the schoolhouse, and I gave my camera to the Major, and he took a picture as the one that is appearing in many places here. And I put my hand around him and I said, "Commander, look at the little bird." And he started laughing at that point in time. As a matter of fact, when I turned these pictures over to the agency in La Paz, I told them there's a picture of Che with me laughing. Of course, at the time that the picture was taken, he changed the expression of his face. Then I took the camera from Major Saucedo, and of course I didn't know what was going to happen, so I closed the lens, put a higher speed, and that picture never came out. And then he left with that. I continued to wait to see what happened, but around 12:30 in the afternoon, here comes a lady from the town with a little radio. And she comes to me and says, "Mi Capitan, why are you going to kill him?" I say, "Lady, why do you say that?" I said, "Well, we saw you being photographed with him out here. And look, the radio is already giving the news that he died from combat wounds." So by listening to that, I knew there was nothing else to be waiting for. His faith was already taken by the Bolivian High Command. So I got into the room, I stood in front of him, and I said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best." He perfectly understood what I was saying. He turned white like a piece of paper, and he said, "It's better this way. I should have never been captured alive." And he pulled out the pipe that he had. He said, "I like to give this pipe to a soldadito who treated me with dignity." So at that point in time, Sergeant Mario Teran, who was the one executing the people in the area, burst into the room. "Yo quiero la pipa, mi capitán, I want the pipe." And she said, "No, a ti no te la doy." So I have to order him 3 times to leave the room, and he did. So I looked at him and said, "Commander, will you give it to me?" So he thought for a while. He had the pipe here, say, "Sí, a ti sí te la doy." He gave me the pipe, I put it here. Then I asked him, "Is anything you want for your family, if I can pass a message?" Then I will say in a sarcastic way, say, "Well, if you can tell Fidel that he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America." And then he changed the impression. He said, "And if you can tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." That was his last word. He approached me, we shook hands, we embraced, and just stood back in attention, thinking I was going to be the one to shoot him. So I left the room. Sergeant Teran was next to a Lieutenant Perez outside the schoolhouse with several soldiers around them. And I look at the sergeant and say, Sergeant's order from your high command to eliminate the prisoner. Don't shoot from here up. Shoot from here down because he's supposed to die from gunshot wound. Sí, mi capitán, sí, mi capitán. And I left. I went to the advanced area where I was photographing the diary. It was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon Bolivian time when I left. Around 1:10, 1:20, I heard a small burst of fire. A few minutes later, Captain Gary Prado and Celso Torrelio both came from the hill. We all got into the room. He was already dead. He was facing the ceiling, and his face was covered with mud. Apparently, he hit the ground. It was very damp. It was dirt floor. And we went around the body, put the foot on top of his body, two of them. And Celso was a little sticky guy, said, "You son of a bitch, you killed so many of my soldiers." And then Gary Prado said, "Mi capitán, we have finished with the guerrillas in Latin America." And I look at him and say, "Mi capitán, we haven't finished them, we have delayed them for a long time." It was close to 2 o'clock, we could hear the helicopter coming, so they left. I asked for a bucket of water, I cleaned his face, I tried to close his jaw with my handkerchief, which blew away in the helicopter later on. I tried to close his eyes and they pop up again. And then they brought a stretcher, and we took the stretcher up to the right side of the helicopter. When we started tying it down, the Major, Niño Guzman, told me, "Capitán, move him forward to balance the helicopter." So I put my hand under his body, I pulled it out, and then when I took the hand out, it was completely covered with blood. Apparently, he hit the aorta, and because of the plastic, the pool of blood was under that. I mentally thought, there are people who say you have blood in your hand. I have the hell of a lot of here. But I didn't mention a thing. I just cleaned it in my pants. I finished tying him down to the helicopter. I got in the back seat. It's a long seat for 3 people, and the pilot was in the front. I sit on the left side to balance that. And at that point in time, a soldier came to where the pilot was, saying, Mayor, Father Schiller went to see him. So we stayed there for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then here comes a French Catholic priest on top of a mule. He got very close to the helicopter and almost got decapitated, but he stopped close enough, but not to be decapitated, and came down with the mule. He looked at Che Guevara's body, and he gave him the last benediction, which I thought to myself, this guy who was an atheist and didn't believe in God, and nevertheless he received the last ritual from the Catholic Church. From there we took off. We landed at Valle Grande. There were about 2,000 people in the runway, where was none when I left. It was a Monday at this time. And there were about 15 additional planes who have arrived in there. There were 4 Bolivian military planes, carry every single general, admiral in the country who wanted to be present for that event. And there were about 10 or 12 of the aircraft that belonged to press, international press, Associated Press, different media from all over the world who arrived there for this event. And then a friend of mine just picked up the body, and they took in an ambulance to the hospital, Nuestro Señor de Malta. And I stayed with them, and then later on in the evening, following evening, we had a meeting with the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Bolivia, General Alfredo Obando Candia. And in that meeting, he was telling one of his colonels, if Fidel Castro denies this is Che Guevara, we need tangible proof of it. Cut his head and put him in formaldehyde. So I said, Mi General, you cannot do that. He said, why not? He said, supposedly Fidel Castro denied this is Che Guevara. You are a head of a state. You cannot cut the head of a human being. He said, well, what do you suggest? From Mi General, you want some tangible proof of it, cut one finger. And we have the fingerprint from the Argentinian Federal Police, and they can be checked. So he went like this, and then he ordered both hands to be cut. So after the press left the Hospital Nuestra Señora de Malta, where they had a laundry in the back, separated from the hospital, when they left around 3 o'clock in the morning, about 3:30 after that, the other Cuban who was with me, he was the one responsible with some Bolivian to take Che Guevara's body and 2 more, and they took it to the very end of the runway, where they had a bulldozer who was extending the runway for bigger planes to land in there. They dug a huge hole, they dropped him and 2 more bodies, and then they covered it up. And they told everybody the next day that he was incinerated and his ashes were thrown over the jungle. Of course, that wasn't true. Now, when later on Fidel claimed that he found Che Guevara's body on the side of the runway with 7 other bodies, definitely that was not Che Guevara's body. So whoever he took back to Cuba was not Che Guevara. But he did have the original hands, because the Minister of Interior, Arguedas, who became disaffected with his own government, later on he went to Cuba and he brought the hands of Che Guevara plus a copy of the diary that Fidel publicized. At the time, the Bolivian government was trying to sell the diary internationally. They had a bid for about $1 million. The idea was to use this money to give it to the widows of the soldier who participated and died fighting against Che. But once Cuba publicized the diary, nobody was interested in buying the diary anymore. And that diary had about 5 or 6 pages missing. A lot of speculation that it was missing because there was something said in there and nobody wanted to be published, or Cuba didn't want it to be publicized. That was not the case. The case was that the diary was photocopied originally by the Minister of Interior because the president wanted to read the original diary, and in copying it real fast, he jumped a few pages, but it wasn't done for any specific purpose. And later on, all the diary completely was publicized.
So you mentioned that when you spoke to Che, you said you had respect for him. What was your opinion of Che and what he was doing before, and did any of it change after you actually met Che?
No, it never changed. The guy was a criminal. There was no question about it. He was a very cruel man. For example, I met later on the guy who trained him, Miguel Sánchez, called El Coreano. And when he was in training in Mexico, Che Guevara used to ask him, what does it feel like when you shoot somebody and you see the blood coming out? What's your feeling when you see that you yourself shoot somebody and see the blood coming out? About 30 years ago, I had a meeting with a lady here in a funeral home in Miami who learned that I participated in the capture of Che Guevara, and she came to me to tell me her story. Her son was 15 years old in 1961, and he was condemned to death, and he was in La Cabaña Fortress because he was writing things in the wall against the regime to make an example. And she went to see Che, and Che did receive her. She tells me that he had his leg on top of the bureau. She said, Senora, what can I do for you? And she told him, Commander, my son is very young, he's 15 years old. He didn't know what he was doing. Please save his life. I can guarantee he will never do it again. So he went, what's the name of your son? And she gave the name. When is he going to be executed? It was on a Monday. And she said, Commander, this is coming Friday. So he called an assistant, and she thought had saved his life, and his answer was, get the lady's son now and execute him now so she doesn't have to wait until Friday. So he was extremely a very cruel man. A lot of people who use the T-shirt have no idea really who he was. He was the same man that at the United Nations claimed and said that if Cuba had the atomic bomb, they would throw it in New York. It didn't matter if millions of innocent people die as long as they could implement socialism in this country. And thus the people idealized this type of animal, and they really didn't know who he was.
And what did you do after this operation with Che, and what time did you retire?
No, I left from there. I went back then from Bolivia to Panama, where we had to spend 2 weeks, sort of waiting time in there. We received a commendation from the President of the United States and the Director of the CIA. Actually, we gave an ID card to buy in the PX, and the one they gave me had visitor pass number 007. And we flew from there back to the United States, and then in '68, I went to Ecuador first to set up an intelligence unit in there for the presidency. And then in the middle of '68, I was taken to Peru, which I became an advisor to a paratrooper unit, anti-guerrilla unit in Peru. That's when military coup of Velasco Alvarado took place, and the military assistance was terminated. So in 1970, I went to Vietnam. I served in Vietnam 2.5 years. I was shot down 5 times. My back became, pretty poor. And then I was evacuated in middle '72 back to the United States. And then they sent me with a waiver to Argentina as an advisor to Argentinian general in counterterrorism in there. Because of the election, I lasted only less than a year. Then back to the United States to call the Caribbean area, did a small tour in Lebanon, who the head of intelligence wanted to set up some intelligence unit against the Hezbollah. Then came back, and then I finally retired in 1976.
Well, thank you for all your service, for everything you've done, and thank you for having this interview for us. We really
and after that, on my own, that's when I went to El Salvador to set up a concept against the guerrillas in El Salvador that was successful. That's when North asked me to help in the resupply operation of the country. I got involved. I had to testify in Congress on the 27th and 28th of May of 1987. I was the only one who went to Congress without immunity and without a lawyer. And everything came out all right. And then I had to testify in John Kerry's committee, which I despise. This guy, he lied in there. Let me just tell you what I told him on the closed hearing. We wanted an open hearing, and he insisted on a closed hearing because he didn't want to hear what I had to say publicly. So when they asked me if I wanted to say something in that close hearing, I look at him and say, Senator, this would be the hardest testimony of my life. He told me, why do you say that, Mr. Rodriguez? I say, Senator, it's very difficult to have to answer questions from somebody that you do not respect. And I don't respect you when you are doing here. And of course, he blew his top. He said, well, don't believe everything you read in the press. I say, Senator, I know that a hell of a lot better than you do. And said, you didn't even have the courage to throw your own medals when you were protesting the Vietnam War. So, well, don't believe that. That was a veteran who asked me to throw his medal. I say, bullshit. You throw that and everybody's perception what it was your medal you were throwing over the White House. So we had that leader encounter, and I hope if you run for president, he'll never make it.